All right, Jason, what do we got in the sidebar right now?
Got so description is more than Copilot for Copilot is more than the developer is more than developer look at it later on.
Yeah, so descriptions, specifically with conversational agents and other things, are actually really important. So let me just kind of go back a little bit and keep in mind there are hidden slides as we mentioned. So message two, I think we'll send the deck, but if you want extra slides, because Jason knows I had 200 plus, we had to cut down because I have a problem, an addiction to slides. But let's talk a little bit about that. So when we were discussing these conversational copilots, it's really important that these descriptions are, look, a lot of us are lowercase d developers or we're capital D developers. And when we're technical, we're used to descriptions kind of just being a throwaway. It's a thing we use for reference on ourselves. But remember, this orchestration engine is using those descriptions. It's using what you tell it to determine whether or not this is the right plugin to use. And so these plugins need to have, I mean, all plugins, but specifically the ones that the orchestrator uses, need to be really described in almost a natural way. Because again, we're technical, so we're like, oh, it should be described this way, in a way that's more natural. So that, like, again, it will be like, oh, this is like the intention. It's connected to the outcome. It's connected to the how people would use it. That's how you have to describe it. And there's lots of examples. Again, there were some slides I removed that had examples of that because of time. But if you're looking for ideas on that, or if you're coming up with yourself, I do encourage it. So that's a great question because it does change the way we kind of work traditionally on development and the importance of things like descriptors. So let me go back to this. What else?
Richard,
Yeah.
I'll just add to that. Not plugin specific, slightly off topic, but from a connector perspective, when you are adding your connectors into the admin center, there is a field because you can tune the search schema and use the metadata to tune the relevancy. Description is a new thing that has been recently added on the name of the connector. That really helps when tuning the relevancy. What do I mean? If you wanted to go into Copilot chat and ask a question, I want all information about X from this particular content source. If you add a description into the connector, that will really help with the relevancy tuning of your result. I know it's not the question that was asked, but it's something that I learned very recently on an actual project with connectors. So something to be mindful of.
And I think a lot of this is what we're learning is, it's through trial and error, which is also why we need to start so early, because a lot of times we're both surprised how effectively it predicts and, provides that response. And sometimes we do need to use the traditional model. And remember, the interface allows people to say, no, I don't want these plugins. Yes, I want these plugins when you're doing your request. So while that's not intuitive to all users, in a smaller subset of users where you've automated their processes, you can teach them, turn on these plugins when you're doing this, turn them off when you're not, because you don't want that pollution or whatever. Of course, you can also set up your plugins themselves to be more cautious and redirect people if it's not before they go on that, that route of conversation dialogue, it can catch it early and be like, hey, we're about to embark on this journey together. Is this what you wanted to do? Or did I get clippy? Did I get ahead of myself? The last thing I'll highlight is so far we haven't really talked about governance. So keep in mind when we create these plugins, they don't apply to every user. You determine how you're going to publish them, who they apply to, and even like who can use plugins and who can build them. All of that can be controlled and rationalized to specific groups or business units. And so when I say get started right away, I'm not saying like give everyone carte blanche, go, everyone go crazy with plugins. What we're saying is in those beginning cycles, picking like a team, typically a high velocity, highly collaborative team of people, cross-functional, whatever it is. Again, I don't really love departmental. I like to think of teams of people because then it's a lowercase p process we're solving, not a capital P one. And so we pick optimally a lowercase p process because those are easier. We show how we can make that better with Copilot. And then, yes, you're going to get demand for these capital P processes, sure. But those ones might need a little bit more IT support or third party or whatever. So again, starting with these like simple ones that would just help 9 people, 20 people, whatever number of people are in that high velocity team, do something that they can't do well today is a really great starting point. And then you learn from that and expand it in other ways. One of the most common ones we see is policies. People ask questions, kind of like an HR bot. You ask questions for Copilot. It doesn't know what to look for, where policies are. So even something simple like helping it, calibrate so it says, look here when people are asking about policy and, give these types of responses and, ask these probing questions about like which, we assume your region is X. Is that right? Things like that before we potentially surface the wrong information to them. Awesome question.
There's another question coming. It says, can our Copilot help us with constantly changing data? Like if we create a Copilot for daily news updates and provide the news website as knowledge source, like that? Well, the answer is yes. And you can handle this in a number of ways. And I'll let Richard, you take it from a plugins perspective. From a connector perspective, you can create full crawls and incremental crawls, and then you can use that as the information changes to populate or present that back. And I'll steal a little bit of Richard's thunder here, but this idea of triggers and actions in the new world of Copilot plugins or Copilot connectors today is that it knows who you are, so it can present you information back. But I'll hand over to Richard as well.
No, it's 100% like a key aspect of why this is cost effective. So earlier, there's so many slides. I know one of the things we talked about was kind of how this industry has changed a little bit, right? And in this, we kind of talked about briefly like this idea of how do you author knowledge sources, right? Because we used to have that problem with knowledge content. So the good news is connectors is one way. As mentioned, real-time data access could be another. So let's say you have a website, but you need like that point in time. And news especially is a good example because it's urgent. Often, let's say you have a supply chain and you want to automate notifications on the supply chain when certain activities happen. So you could have people make simple requests like, hey, what's going on, that's important that I should talk to my customers about today, my suppliers today. It goes, hey, I've looked at, supply chain analysis site X, which is, a bunch of different news sources. And this is like really, there's flooding here. What do you want to do about it? And then maybe it even helps them action it. Oh, I want you to communicate to that supplier and ask them like, is this going to impact our delivery or schedule? So you could automate. So that simple request could just be some simple actions. I don't have to go open up Outlook and create an email. It can just automate all those actions, send it to that supplier and notify them. That sequence is critical that you use the latest data, right? Now, I will say a trick that I do see happen a lot, we haven't really talked about it, is like, where is the data coming from and what are the limitations there? So one of the things we haven't really addressed is like where the data gaps are. So when you use something like SharePoint in a few of the plugin models, you're essentially limited on the number of SharePoint spaces. However, it's not a real limit. So yeah, functionally it is a limit, but you can create like your own service that then grows and grabs from SharePoint, or you can make it dynamic. So instead of hard coding, like look at the SharePoint site, look at this website, etc., you could have that be dynamic, where it's looking at particular sites, pages, content based on what you're trying to do, right, from a Copilot perspective. So there are, if you are concerned about, oh, I saw this limit of four, I think it's 4 or 5, SharePoint sites. I'm here to say yes, that's something you should be aware of, but it's not really a limit because there's really simple ways you can work around it if you still want that sequence or that action to work. And this is why that understanding the full scope of extension is important, not just what's that easy 101 level of extension capability that I have. And yeah, that sometimes does mean going a little bit outside of Copilot Studio, but even that with the Teams toolkit and other things is becoming a lot more accessible. So that's my quick commentary on that on the back end of it. Great questions.
Just one other question here. What's the best data structure for our data? Is a basic table fine for it to understand what is going on, or does it need to be in 3NF? I can add some color first, and then Richard, if you will. So I think Copilot does a really good job of understanding table structures. So you upload a document or you index a document, and it does all of the chunking for you. So it does understand information within tables, so you don't have to do anything in particular. What I will stress is if the table doesn't have good headings or good columns and good information and relational paragraphs, that's when you start to have problems. If as a human, you can't say that this table is telling you information about that, then you will struggle. Flipping into the Azure AI search world, that is more of a challenge because that's where document intelligence comes in and chunking using particular methods. You really have to hone down. But the original question, I suspect, is around Copilot. And I think it does a fairly good job. You don't really need to have it in a particular format. And
another thing to consider here is, again, complex limitations. So like in SharePoint, ASPX files for now, don't work. So depending on how you're pulling the data in, you need to keep in mind that there are things Copilot will readily understand, and this list is changing pretty rapidly. And then there's scenarios where, again, you might have to do something between it. One last comment, this comes up a lot. let's say you're coming up with your architecture, you're like, oh, I want to automate this process. And then you look at the data and you're like, well, we can put it in whatever. We can do a data warehouse. We can put it into Dataverse. We can, pull it into pages and generate pages from it. And then look at the pages. We can put it in a Microsoft SharePoint list or something. The problem there is making sure you understand which ones of those will work. I see a lot of customers, because many people use lists. They'll use lists and then they're like, Copilot's not getting it because that bridging hasn't been established yet, again, for now. And so it's important to understand which ones do work with Copilot and which ones work more effectively with Copilot, because there is an impact there. But I agree with everything you said, Jason. Generally speaking, the more structured your data is, generally the better it is. But if it's too structured, it becomes quite problematic because people are asking generalized questions through natural language, so it can sometimes struggle with weighting in that. Yeah. Great one.
Can we take one last question?
Yeah, I've got time. If you want to keep going, we can. Yeah.
Can we use Copilot to start financial transactions like funds transfer and paying bills, etc.? I mean, this is flows and triggers all over. That Copilot Studio is going to be your friend here. I don't know the specific use case, but absolutely you can start to do this using Copilot Studio. Yeah, creating flows, using triggers to run based on certain things. Richard, anything to add?
So two tricky things here. So functionally, yes. There's with enough ibuprofen and money, you can do anything. Human in the loop is really important.
Yes.
And what is classified as authorization can be different based on industry and a bunch of other factors. And it's important to understand that, an e-signature or something else is valid in different scenarios, whereas you just saying yes on a conversational engine may not make the same criteria. Lastly, we haven't really talked about responsible AI, but there are patterns of risk that you generally shouldn't expose Copilot to when the hallucination or the error rate, different terms for this, right? It's ungrounded insights. If there's that risk exposure, it's often not worth it to do some of those last mile things. So again, this is really more of a broader discussion on, is it publicly exposed? Because remember, we haven't really talked about declarative copilots, but there's ways to take the Copilot engine and all it can do on extending and actually use it in other ways. And I think the risk, generally speaking, is just be very cautious when it's taking an action on your behalf that could have significant consequences. If it's really minor and it's a really easy thing to return and then go through that sequence, and you're just doing it at scale, could work fine. If you want to do it internally, for a receipt approval, and then you need to work that back later. Again, there's lots of exceptions and pathways for that. Maybe you are more comfortable with that. But if we're talking about scaled scenarios for this, I would be really cautious on payment processing and scenarios like that. You can do it, but like I said, you might want to really extra code a bunch of business logic and approvals and things like that to ensure that there's humans in the middle and for compliance reasons that you're meeting those criteria. Copilot licensing a little bit. Yeah, so there's a great question about Copilot licensing. So maybe I'll talk about that. We're talking about cost, of course. So two things on Copilot, and I'm going to go back to magnifying.
Oh, there's me.
That's right. I just like your smile. I just needed to zoom on your smile. All right, let me go back for a second and talk about this chart a little bit. So one of the things to understand is that when you purchase Copilot from Microsoft 365, it costs $30 US per user per month, right? And each of those other Copilot experiences, right? Where is that? So I should have went to it this way. They all have, different pricing and considerations. So what you want to do is you want to think about what do you typically add into that. So before I even say, is Copilot $30 per user? I actually don't think it is. I think the first thing to understand is if you buy Copilot from Microsoft 365, you should put some dollar amount for adoption services. And then that should be part of your planning, because you have to do stuff, right? You have to coach people, you have to mentor them, you have to do communities, you have to keep stuff updated. So you have to constantly take the Microsoft wonderful material they keep releasing and find a way to feed that into your engine for digital excellence internally. And there's a cost to that. So I always like to say it's not $30, it's $30 plus, this adoption tax. But on top of that, a lot of customers very commonly will also invest in Viva Insights, which is $4 per user per month, or the Viva Insights and Glint capability, which is $6 per user per month, as well as technically Pulse. They'll invest in that because that gives them a much richer set of data for adoption and the dashboards and things like that. So that's really common. Lastly, you have some people that will also invest in Engage Premium as well as Viva Amplify, because then they can do campaigns, communication. They can do things like in Viva Engage Premium, they have richer data, Ask Me Anythings, all sorts of things that can help foster and facilitate it. And so sometimes when you start to add the Viva experiences and employee experience investments on top, you might also see that being 30 to now $8 or 30 to, these are $2, by the way, for these two together. It's called the CNC license. So again, lots more to talk about there, but there are some things to consider there that can increase the, we'll call it baseline licensing cost. Keep in mind, each of those things does increase the return. It helps you get more back from it, but it is worth considering. Going back to the Copilot Studio stuff now, when you have Copilot in the Power Platform, and we think about using Copilot Studio, what's important there is to understand the way it's licensed is in the Copilot Studio framework. So, or sorry, in the Power Platform framework. So there's this wonderful document, because I have gotten into trouble from referencing this stuff. Do I have it open here? And because it constantly changes. And so you'll find I'm much more cautious nowadays. Let me see if I can quickly find it for you guys. Here we go. So I always have it open, so it comes up all the time. So there is this Power Platform licensing guide. I'll see if I can create a link for you in a second to it. But this is basically what you're looking for. And it has regular updates. This is August's update. There were changes. And so the pricing is specific for Copilot Studio is represented here with a bunch of caveats and considerations. And again, this is a very long document for a good reason. It's 34 pages. So make sure you understand, how it fits. But then the other traditional licensing consideration is how are we going to start building these extensions? How are we going to maintain them? That's where you start to think about this Copilot Studio subscription cost. Lastly, of course, there's Azure and related services, the connectors, Power Automate for Flow. There's a bunch of other potential licensing implications. But the simplest answer is it's not $30 per user per month. It's $30 plus this, plus that. And you take that, 200 and then you fractionalize that across your users, and then you get a kind of an estimate of what it really is. And again, I'm not trying to scare people away, but it's important to plan like that when you think about Copilot's investment, if you really want to get the kind of return that you saw in specifically this type of slide, right? Because if you just buy the $30 and you just deploy it responsibly, effectively, you're going to get return. It's going to be great, but it's so much more if you do those adoptions, compounding returns, or so much more if you, add that extensibility and capability there. All right. So with that, let me go back. How are we doing on time? Can you stick on a little bit longer, Jason? Is there more questions?
Yeah, I've got a couple more minutes and then I have to drop, unfortunately.
I know it's late. Jason is after hours right now, so probably between him and a nice beverage.
No, it's a child, unfortunately.
Okay, even more important. So this will be the last one then. Which one would you like to pick there? Information sensitivity one?
Yeah, let's do that, guy. Let's do it.
Okay. So while Jason's reading it, so there's a question regarding sensitive information. Essentially, can the data train itself? Like, what are the risks around bias? There's a bunch of hidden questions in this. So let's talk a little bit about sensitivity, privacy, and then exposure to information. So that's probably the obvious one. And then maybe even a little bit about how, these models use it. Go ahead.
Yeah. So the first thing we did touch on this ever so slightly. It's about what information you're indexing. From a graph connector's perspective, you choose what information you want to put into the graph. I will say that I have seen, even though when I've run lots of these projects where people select the information that they want to index, then they realize that there is security holes in their applications and they haven't reviewed their security for a while. And then what you end up getting is, sensitive information displayed. So you have to be very careful. And what I say is human in the loop. Richard mentioned it before. Select the information that you want to index and then test it before you pass it out to any other users. The other thing that we can do from a sensitivity perspective is around anonymization or redaction. So you don't always have to push the content into the index and expose PII information or in Europe GDPR information, because you can, using the auto classify, you can take out information as you index it or hide it as you push it into the index. Now, from a plugin perspective, as Richard is highlighting, and he touched on this in the session, is that there are compliance vulnerabilities. And for me, this is about at the plugin layer. What plugins are you passing out to the right information, or to the people that are accessing them? So be very, very careful around this.
Yeah, and just to double down on that, I think, there's a big benefit for the graph connectors in that the compliance control is there, right? If you use, Purview, use techniques, there's a lot of different ways it can work with this content. And today, that's often why you'll see an and, right? Remember we mentioned and? So you're going to use both of these because then you, as much as possible, you're benefiting here and then you're exceptioning, right? And then you're designing based on your own compliance rules for that over here. It is important to understand that Microsoft doesn't train their models on your data. That's important. So into privacy law and things like that. It's also important to understand that it never goes like if you're using OpenAI, which it currently is, for the LLM foundational model that's supporting it, that also doesn't expose that data. It's done in a way in which it protects you. So responsible AI practices and those types of things are in flow there. But again, I think this is really the center of the discussion. It's like, and let me put it a different way. When we do technical readiness with customers, we always talk about like, oh, like what are the things we worry about? And everyone brings up security traditionally, right? Like they say, oh, we have oversharing, we have these sites that are exposed, we have this stuff. And that's an inherited risk, right? It's an issue that exists today. If you use search, it's going to be the same risk exposure. It's not a new risk exposure. It's just a more visible exposure. However, it is a real thing that if you don't have content labeled correctly today, and
Right.
you create new content exponentially, increased volume, variety, and velocity of content because of AI. And that happens a lot. You often take content, you create content from that content, right? Create a new PowerPoint presentation from this, create an email from this. Because you're creating content from this source, if this source is not labeled, that is a problem because what ends up happening is now to label it properly, you have to go back through and understand where this content originated from to go all the way back through and sequence the right labeling. And so I actually really encourage that the number one technical risk isn't actually security traditionally, I think. It's the compliance piece, it's the labels. And that's sensitivity, so it is arguably security as well, but specifically because it's so costly later to fix it, to go back like this because you're exponentially increasing, the volume, variety, and velocity of content. And so I would say if you have good DLP, you have basic, policies around labeling, and you're good there. And when you pull in new data, you've got like the right strategy on that with purview, et cetera. Then I'd say you're in a really good place where most of this risk exposure is just doing best practices when you think about how you're extending Copilot. And with that, great discussion. Really loved it. We'll let Jason go. Thanks so much, everyone, for your time and your attention. Again, a reminder: there's a wonderful webinar coming up, and if you're looking at this recording later, again, please reach out if you have questions and if there's anything we can do to help. Bye for now, everyone.
Thank you.